Alright, so first thing you want to do is on this paper, write your name. Your first and last name. And then go ahead and put the class period. If I find one of these papers on the ground or something, I'll know which period it goes to and will help me find which seat it belongs to if it was left out or something like that. So in this case, I'm going to put 1A, but if someone was online and there's a different period, they'd put that period. All right, now we want to draw what we see in this image. Now, we've got a circle here, and then just a straight line at a slight diagonal going up and down. But we also want to draw this oval shape underneath, which will show us our shadow. All right, so go ahead and we'll do this impasto one first. And it doesn't have to be perfect. If you wanted to, you could use another tool, set something down on there that's about that size of a circle and add it, but you don't have to. Alright, so I've got the circle, I've got the background, and then I'm going to go ahead and add a shadow. So now that I've kind of drawn this out, I'm also going to notice a few other things. So notice the shadow of that sphere. There's kind of two shadows. There's this darker shadow and then a lighter shadow. So I'm going to go ahead and add both. I've also got to kind of correct that bottom one. I made it a little bit too small, or a little bit going up. Then we could look at that sphere itself. Maybe we can divide it a little bit. So from here to about here, and it kind of comes around. Like that little section is a little bit darker than the rest. So it's kind of coming up. Very good. So that is like the darkest section there. It's kind of interesting. Underneath this sphere, you can see there's some light areas. That's because light is hitting the table, bouncing off the table, and going underneath the sphere. So just keep that in mind as we're drawing this out. That's why I'm drawing this darkest section like I am. Now we want to divide up this section a little bit more. So like you'll notice on this left side, it's a little bit lighter than on this right side. So this right side is really dark and then gradually gets to a lighter color. We're going to be using 6 tones, where 1 is going to be the lightest, and 6 is going to be the darkest. You don't necessarily have to write this down. I'm just writing it down just so it's visual. And then we'll have all the tones in between. 1 would be like white. 6 would be like black. Right? So looking on my sphere, maybe on the side of the wall or side of the counter right here, maybe right underneath here, maybe those sections would be 1s. So I'm going to kind of mark this off right here and then label it as a 1. Mark it off right here and label it as a 1. Right, so now we're going to go through and just subdivide it into more sections and then label those numbers on our drawing or on our image as well as on our paper or our drawing, whatever you want to call it. So maybe this back area, that's a 1. Maybe right in here, that's a 1-ish. And then do the same thing on my paper. This will make it a little bit easier when we start to paint all of these different sections. We'll mix up a color 1, white, and then we can paint all these sections that light color. So maybe back here that's like a 2, and it kind of comes over here. It's a 2, and then underneath this 2, maybe that's a 3. And as we look over here, maybe that section right here is a 2. And maybe right in here, kind of got like this section. Right there is a 3. And this 3 ends up going to about right here-ish. Then we've got in this side a 4. Right above the shadow, that's similar to this 3, and similar to, right close to it is similar to the 2. So I'm going to put like a 2 here. And a 3. Now the second shadow, that's kind of darker than all of these, so I might put a 5. Maybe right here, that's also 5. This really dark area, that's a 6. It's a 6. So as I'm labeling these, I'm also looking at comparisons. So if I labeled this area 1, and that area on the sphere is also very light, I might label that one a 1. If this really dark shadow is a 6, and then the dark shadow in the background here is a 6, I need to make sure to label those the same. If starting about right here, say about right here, ends up going to like a 5, I want to make sure to label that. So I've labeled all of these. You'll repeat that for each little rectangle that you have on your paper. But for these other two, it's a little bit easier because you've already labeled everything that you need to. So I would just look at this drawing now to do your first drawing with a pencil down below. All right, so if a student is following along online, they're gonna do the exact same thing. If you had missed class or something, I'm gonna start doing more recordings similar to this because I don't have time to make the short videos that I did before. I'm just going to record when I'm doing it in class so that students online can get the same instruction. But what I'm doing is, if you're online, if you get done with a certain area and I'm paused here because I'm walking around the room, then you can just fast forward the video slightly until you see me doing something else with the page. Alright, so now I'm going to get my palette out. I've already added the damp paper towel onto my board. You can use anything, but I suggest using the board I give in the art kits. And then the paper towels, they could be napkins, whatever, as long as it holds moisture. And then I'll use my palette knife to add paint to my palette itself. And then I'm going to be using these two brushes. This is a number 2 brush, the gold brush, and this one's a number 8 brush, also the gold brush. I'm not going to use my blue brush. So these are both round brushes. Alright, so on my palette, for impasto, what that means is thick paint. In fact, I'm going to write this to the side. You might want to write it too, just so that you remember. Thick paint. Blending is just where it's gradually blending. You might want to write next to it gradient, because that's like what we did with watercolors. We did a gradient. Most of the time when we were shading, we did a gradient. And then distinct brush strokes, that's similar to a step value scale. So I might write step value scale or step values. So with gradient, you might be doing more mixing on the paper itself. As you're putting a number 3 paint down, and then while it's still wet, you get some 4 paint, and then blend those two in a little bit, and then get some 3 paint and blend that in. So you might be doing more blending on the paper for a gradient. For distinct brush strokes, you'll be doing more blending in your palette, not necessarily on your paper. And for impasto, you might be doing a lot of overlapping and layers. And we'll be using small brush strokes for impasto. Alright, let's go ahead and add some paint. And also, for this, you can use any of the techniques we went over before. You can choose to use your monochromatic, where you're using black, white, and one color. You could choose to do analogous colors, where it's going from yellow, orange to orange. Or maybe you want to use complementary colors. Maybe you want to use a combination of multiple. But the biggest thing is that we're copying the shading using some of these colors. Oh, this person actually Yaharia. Oh, wait, Yaharia's not here. Alright, so I'm going to, for this impasto, I'm going to just do monochromatic colors. So I'm going to use black, white, and one color. So in my palette, I'm going to first take out some white paint. This is a small area, so I'm not going to need a crazy amount of paint. I did 3 scoops. Maybe I'll do 1 scoop in the middle to get my middle tones. I'm going to do 2 scoops. Now my white paint is kind of running out because I've been using it for, you know, several different classes. And then with this extra paint on my palette knife, I'm going to wipe it off in the middle there. And then there's still a little paint on this palette knife, so I'm going to wipe it with my paper towel. We don't want a lot of paint going down the drain, plus we don't want to dirty up our water container very much. So with this almost clean palette knife, I dip it in the water once, and then I wipe it again with my paper towel. So now the palette knife is clean. I've utilized most of the paint, and then I don't want my white paint to dry out, so I'm going to put on that lid again. And since I'm going to be doing monochromatic, I've got a couple sections of white, and then I'm going to add a little section of black. Not very much, just a little bit, maybe one knife's worth, one scoop. And then I'll put that leftover in the middle to get off some of that paint. Wipe it once with my paper towel, dip it in the water, and again wipe that off. So now my palette knife is clean. I don't want my black to dry out, so I got to put that lid back on. The reason I mentioned always putting that lid back on your container is because if you don't, it will dry out. So it's a good habit to get into to do that. Now for impasto, I can use whatever color I want. I'm going to go ahead and use, I'll use blue. You can use whatever color you want to. If you don't want to use blue, that's fine. I would suggest though using a color that is darker. Like I wouldn't want to use yellow, because then when I'm making all my colors and mixing, that yellow will be difficult to go from a 6, which is really dark, all the way to a 1. Yellow is such a light color, you'd only get from like a 3 to a 1. But 6, or blue, you can get really dark. So I've added blue in my palette. I'm going to wipe off some of that extra paint just to the side of it, and then repeat that step of wiping off your palette once, dip it in the water, drop your towel. You don't have to drop your towel. And then wipe it again. Right, there you go. And then remember, as always, put on that lid. So I've got the main colors I need, white, black, and the one color to do monochromatic right here. I'm going to actually use my number 2 brush, number 2 round brush. It's just a little bit smaller. And as I'm doing this impasto style, I will be just adding little tiny strokes, tiny paint marks. Some people like to paint it first, the colors it is, kind of like the distinct brush strokes, and then afterwards do dots of paint. That's fine. Some people like to start with just the light color and then dip their brush into the next color and then do some of the mixing on the paper itself. There's different techniques you can use to do that, but basically it's thicker paint. So whatever technique you feel most confident with, do that one, and then just make sure it's thicker paint. So before I start using my brush, I want to make sure paint goes up and absorbs into the bristles. So I'm going to dip my brush in the water, and then I just pinched out any excess water. So now the brush bristles are moist. Then I'm going to start with, I like to do some of my mixing on the board itself. So I'm going to start with that one area. Then dipping my brush in the white again, I'm going to go over the 2 area. I know some of you are like, well, Mr. Schaefer, that's going to make it too light. You're right. But then I'm going to take my brush and dip just the tip of it into blue, and then I'm going to go over that number 2 area again. See how I'm just just by dabbing it, I'm mixing the colors. Then I'm going to get some more paint, add it to the 3 area. Dip just the tip of my brush again into that 3 area, or into the blue, and then going over this 3 area again. Maybe it needs to be a little bit darker, so dip the tip of my brush in some of the blue. So now I'm doing this 5 area, adding white to it. I know this 5 needs to be really dark, so when I dip my brush into the blue, I dip quite a bit. Some of you would be like, whoa, Mr. Schaefer, I can't see my lines anymore. That's okay. You mainly had those lines as a guide, and then after a while you're going to be looking at your actual drawing and say, or your actual image, and say, okay, what is matching, what is not. If I want to get rid of some of that paint off my brush, I'm just going to press it down and then rotate my brush as I lift to get rid of some of that paint. Now I'm getting just that number 6 or straight blue to mix into this area right here where the 6 is. I'm going to let that slightly blend into the other shades. Alright, each time I'm looking at my actual image or still life and saying, okay, what do I need to darken, what do I need to lighten? And then eventually I might go back and say, okay, I need to darken it even more, so I grab a tinge of black and then add that to the mix. I could use my palette itself, maybe grabbing some black here, grabbing some blue, make a dark color, and then go over that area as well. One fun thing about using tints and shades to create these dark shades and dark tones, and using impasto or the style of thick paint, you can let the paint stay a little bit moist and just keep adding layers and layers. Right, so you might end up if you kind of squint your eyes, it will help you see if it's mixing properly or where you need to add more color. So anyway, that's what you do with impasto. We're not going to keep going in this area. You'll have some time to work on that on your own. But let's also talk about distinct brush strokes. With distinct brush strokes, more of my mixing is going to happen on my palette. And then what you want to think of, the brush strokes might touch each other, but you're going to try and keep it somewhat separated. So like right now I'm doing this 6 area. You might even have some of the white showing through. It's up to you. Maybe I don't want the white showing through. So I've gone through that 6 area. I'm going to do some mixing on my palette. Paint the 5 area. 3 area, might have to mix some white in with that. And as you're doing this, you can experiment with not cleaning out your brush each time, or maybe trying to clean out your brush each time. So like this, it's really a gray mixed with the blue hue to create this next tone. Where earlier I started with white and color and did most of it with white and color, so there wasn't much gray. If I did need to clean out my brush, I don't want to just dip all that paint into my water container because it's going to contaminate my water quite a bit. So what I'll do is I'll first wipe off some of that paint with my paper towel, then rinse out my brush, dab it dry so that now I can get some solid white to paint this top section. If as you're painting you realize you need to lighten up a color or something, you need to go over it again, that's totally fine. Like maybe I decided this number 2 area I want to lighten up more. I don't think it really has to, but let's say it did. I just mix up that color I want and then just paint over it. If your paints are dry, it's pretty easy to paint over previous colors. Then maybe if I'm going to lighten that number 2 area, maybe I'll slightly change that number 3 area as well. So that's the idea behind the step values. You're going to paint everything, right? The background, the sphere, you want to paint everything on it, but for instruction's sake, I'm just going to show you how to do this. And then the last one, gradient, is what we've already been kind of doing. The biggest difference with gradient compared to distinct brush strokes is that you'll be doing some of the mixing on the paper itself. So I'll start with the number 1 area. So I've got to get the paint off my brush, clean water. And with blending, some of you will be like, oh, Mr. Schaefer, can I do a little bit thicker? Or do I have to keep my paints really thin? That's up to you. You can do in between, you can do both, but all I'm really doing is going over it with a certain color, and while it's still wet, adding more color to it, and then overlapping. So like right here, in between the two that's not quite blended, and while it's still wet, I might get rid of some of that paint on my brush, dip in the white area, take some of that from the top, bring it down, and then gradually blend those two colors. If it starts getting too dark, maybe dip in the white again. Just so that's a gradual blending. Right, so on this one that's a gradient, I'm going back and forth, back and forth. Might have to clean out my brush every once in a while when I need to go pull from the white and blue over to the darker colors, or maybe pulling the darker colors over to the lighter. This part though is big on just practice, getting an idea of what works and what doesn't. Right, so that gives you an idea of what to do with this worksheet. Last time we started on this paper. Those of you that weren't here, we chose complementary colors, which are colors that are across from each other on the color wheel. So if it helps, you can draw a color wheel on the side of your paper. Red, yellow, and blue being the primary colors. Purple, orange, and green being the secondary colors. And you even have tertiary colors, which are in between a primary and secondary. So in between red and orange would be red-orange. In between yellow and orange would be yellow-orange. Those are examples of tertiary colors. So anyway, analogous colors, you just choose 3 colors next to each other on the color wheel. So red, red-orange, and orange. Primary, tertiary, and secondary next to each other on the color wheel. Those would be analogous colors. So go ahead and choose analogous colors or complementary colors. The goal of this though is to practice the blending and see what happens when you mix black with a color or white with a color, or doing blending on the paper versus in the palette, or maybe keeping them separated. But practice with those mixing of colors. I'm going to walk around, see how you're doing. I don't want my brush to dry with paint in it, so I wipe it off, rinse it. I could actually even leave it in the water if I wanted to. I'm not going to leave it in the water. I just rinsed it out though. I'll set it to the side. But anyway, this is what we're working on today. Between this sheet and this sheet, we want to work on these all today and then next time, and then we'll start our next section of art after that.